did that. All right, let's go back. All right, double check that from you guys and just make sure it's working. Okay, so, and then you also need to have water, right? In terrestrial plants, water is critical for producing the parts of your plants. But one of the key takeaways that you have for photosynthesis is that it produces the energy. It's not really producing the components of what your plant's comprised of. The whole purpose of photosynthesis is to produce energy. And the reason you have that energy is so it can create the macromolecules that produces cellulose that comprises your plants. So the NPK and plus C, and I always emphasize this for aquatic plants, carbon's critical. These are drivers of growth, and without those 4 components, you're not going to have any plant growth, or at least your plant growth is going to be limited. So back quite a long time ago, I think in the 70s, Charles Anderson and Ole Peterson of the Tropica, you guys know Tropica plants. Ole Peterson was involved with Tropica, but Charles Anderson was part of one of the Danish universities. They demonstrated in a study that plant growth benefits from CO2 addition, and it's not just at the highest levels of light, but at all light levels. So even in lower light levels, even lower light tanks, CO2 injection greatly adds to the plant growth. I've run very low light tanks, basically shrimp tanks, with just a little bit of added CO2. You don't need much, but just that little boost of CO2, you can see improved health and improved growth of your plants. You see this boost in plant mass. So with their study, they showed that as light increases, CO2 becomes a limiting factor. And what you're seeing here is at a certain point, as the CO2, as light increases, you have to go up concurrently with the carbon dioxide as well as any of the other components that your plant needs for the plant growth. If you don't increase the input of your macromolecules, doesn't matter how much light you give the plants, it's just not going to grow, right? And these are all components of the plants are required for the plant growth. So what they showed, and they showed this with Riccia. Some of you guys probably know what Riccia is. It's a kind of a liverwort or moss. Then they showed just the amount of mass that you could get based on different light levels. As it increases the photosynthesis, you get a much better increase in plant growth and plant mass. Whereas with lower amount of CO2, it caps off, right? And then there's a point there where it flips. Instead of being photosynthesis, it actually drops into respiration, which is what we're doing, right? When we breathe, when we're doing stuff, we're burning energy, and that's what the plants are doing in that case. So keep that in mind. High light levels, high CO2, you get the most growth, and then it drops exponentially as you drop the amount of light or you drop the amount of CO2, and that limits what your growth is going to be. So why is CO2 so important? Like I mentioned, it's one of 4 macromolecules. We often talk about NPK, like nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium. And what you find with phosphorus and nitrogen in particular is ATP. It's a component of ATP, which is an energy source for your plants. NADPH is also one of the energy sources for your plants. So your nitrogen and phosphorus are 2 of the biggest components in energy production for your plants to produce your cellulose or produce the glucose, which comprises your cellulose, right? But what they don't talk about is carbon a lot of times, because in the atmosphere you got plenty of it. You don't have to worry about it. But in a plant tank, it's very limited, and we'll kind of get into like what the levels are here in a second. Potassium, on the other hand, I mean, we hear about people dosing potassium. It's used a lot in terrestrial plants for moderating and controlling the stomata. which allows water and transport of water or release of water to the environment. In planet tanks, it actually regulates a lot of the enzymes that's involved in glucose production or in the macromolecule synthesis. So if you look at glucose, just based on the molecule itself, you see 6 carbons, right? So without a heavy input of carbon, you're not going to get a lot of plant growth. So carbon's absolutely critical, and I consider it one of the essential macromolecules in a planet tank. So CO2 itself then generates glucose, which is a single molecule, and then it condenses, or it comes together and forms cellulose, which is a polymer of glucose. Each of these are a single glucose molecule. So if you look at that and how many carbon are involved in each of these glucose molecules, you then kind of realize it's a huge component of it. And it's 44%, almost 45% of your cellulose, of the plant mass. The rest is oxygen, and then hydrogen is a small component of it. But if you're producing, an inch of growth, right, of a plant, you're going to require a ton of carbon. And in a planet tank, it's quite limited. And how do we get around that? So what is a good way for us to target CO2 levels? CO2 in the ambient environment, basically what we were exposed to is about 415 parts per million, which is a ton of carbon. Hence the reason terrestrial plants, your gardens, your flowers, you got easy access to carbon. Surface CO2 at the pond. So this is the interface of the air and the water, that first couple of inches or first inch of a pond or a lake, that is only measured at 5 to 10 parts per million. Very, very low, right? In our tanks, we try to target about 25 to 30 parts per million, if not higher. And for us to get that amount of CO2, there's no way for us to kind of get that CO2 up by diffusion alone. It has to be injected into the tank. So as that 5 to 10 parts per million at the surface of the water, that decreases pretty much down to 0 within the first foot in a pond or a lake. Or that amount is so limited, it's maybe 1 to 2 parts per million as it drops low. If you look in a pond or a lake, the plants, they reach for their surface. And a lot of them will go to the top and come over and kind of expose their leaves on the top of the surface. That's a way for them to really grow quickly. That's a way for them to secure CO2 very easily in the tank. So they're adapted to do that, grow toward the light and then grow toward the CO2. They get all the other nutrients and stuff that they need in the tank, in the water. Now, there's traditionally in the planet tank, there's this chart that we've talked about, and this is, this is 30 years ago when this chart came out, when I was first getting into the planet tanks in 89, way back in 87, 89. This is a measure of between the KH in your water and the pH, and gives you an approximation of what the CO2 level looks like in the tank. If your pH is at a certain level and your KH is at a certain level, the CO2 that you're injecting is going to be at that particular concentration. But there's a caveat to that. And this kind of counts for the reason there's a caveat. When you have CO2 plus water, it produces carbonic acid, which in turn breaks apart, producing hydrogen and with carbonate, right? So your hydrogen is what drives the pH down. And this will be important as we move into some of the next measure, what your amount of CO2 based on what your levels are based on the CO on the pH alone. This chart only assumes that the only thing in there is carbonate and pH. That's it. But a lot of us are now using aqua soils that have tannins and humic acids that are incorporated into it, and that actually gets released into the water, and that drives your pH down as well. Others use carbonate-based stone, Sirius stone, elephant stone, is heavily carbonate based, and it changes and releases carbonate into your water, constantly adjusting your pH, right? It increases your pH. So that this chart actually is not accurate at all. Your tap water, Chicago tap, has a ton of KH in it. So you have to know what your KH is before you go in. You have to know how to adjust that, how that adjusts the pH, and how that affects how much carbon dioxide is being saturated into your water. So what works better? One of the things that people have started doing, and it's a way for us to measure the CO2, is measuring the pH initially when the water doesn't have any carbon dioxide in it. You know what your baseline pH is going to be. This is going to incorporate everything that's in your tank, any kind of carbonates, any type of acid, any kind of hydrogen that's producing the acid that's going to drive your pH down. That's your baseline. No CO2 injection. So what I usually do is I will turn on my CO2 about an hour before my lights come on to kind of saturate the water with carbon dioxide before it flips on. And at that point, I should know my pH is like 7.5 or 7.2 here. Let's say it's 7.2. I will increase the amount of CO2 going into the tank until it hits the saturation point at equilibrium and drops down to about 6.2. Now, once you get that 1 point drop, the assumption is that that 1 point drop is equivalent to about 30 to 35 parts per million CO2 saturated in the water. It's a pretty standard way of doing it nowadays. And this takes into account all the issues of any kind of acids, any kind of tannins, any kind of carbonates that are already in your water. It's the accurate way of doing it. Using that chart, using pH, KH, it's because of all the other compounding factors, you can't get a good measure of what your carbon dioxide is. Okay, any questions? Okay. Yep.
Would you measure this then with the API that the test measure kit?
You can. Yep. I used to do that. You're going to have to. So the one thing about the API master, the test kits, it's hard to see the color sometimes. Put it up against a white background, and that's key. If you're looking at it through a clear bottle, that the way the light hits it will kind of, you get kind of a bend insertion in the light, changing the coloration. Putting up against a white background is what they recommend, and it works pretty well. I'm just trying to get down to that. If you're injecting at a high enough level and you're hitting a saturation point, usually that takes about an hour to an hour and a half. If you're injecting enough. Sometimes it might take a little longer, and sometimes if you're not injecting enough, it never gets down to a point where it drops 1 point. Yep.
There's a lot of talk about stability in water parameters,
Mm-hmm.
presumably pH. And what about, this is a big swing?
Yep.
How big a deal is that?
So that I know that I get a lot of arguments from people who have fish, delicate fish. Here you go. In ambient conditions in the environment, external environment, fish that are in lakes and ponds go through swings sometimes of pH like 2 to 3 pHs in a single day, depending on how much light is being exposed, how much plant mass is in the water. That swing is a lot of times dependent on the photosynthesis of the plant, right? I mean, so that you could start out with a lot of, well, let's say a pond in Chicago is at 7.8, 8.0. During the day, if there's a lot of plant mass, that pH will swing all the way down to about maybe 6. And during the peak hours of photosynthesis, the fish are fine. They adapt to that swing as long as it's a slow, steady, kind of a slow decay in the pH. And as you flip off the lights in the end of the day for your planet tank, that pH will rise back up, but it's going to be kind of a slow rise back up. So there's not a sudden drop in the pH. Now, there's a caveat to that, though. If you're adding fish to a tank that is CO2 injected, I turn off the pH. I turn off the CO2 before I add my fish. And the reason for that is you're dropping them into a tank that's going to have a fairly significant pH crash compared to what they're probably used to. So what I will usually do if I go to the GCCA swap and I know I'm getting fish, even if I don't know I'm getting fish, I flip off the CO2 for that day, and I bring it in, get the water, kind of get them warmed up and release them into the water. Then I flip the CO2 on and let them kind of acclimate slowly back up and down. If you drop a fish right into a highly saturated CO2, you're going to kill them. And I've unfortunately made that mistake a couple times. Okay, so there's other ways of doing pH measurements. Let's see. Yeah. So this is called a drop checker. You have a solution that is KH4, and it's specially made with bromophenol blue, which is an indicator, an acid-based indicator. You basically take a pipette and you squeeze it into the ball of the drop checker and stick this on the side of your tank. Now, I'm going to pass this around so you guys can kind of take a look at it. Now, this is an easy way of kind of getting a measure of how much CO2 is in your tank, but it's highly, highly inaccurate because it's based on color, right? I mean, if you're looking at color, if your tank has any kind of tannins in it, that color might look a little different. If the tank is cloudy, it's going to be tough to see it. In addition to that, if there's any kind of liquid from the tank that gets contaminated in the bromophenol blue solution, it's going to start changing the chemical nature of your solution. So I'm not a big fan of this. I use it as more of a macro way of just taking a quick peek at what's going on in my tank. I don't use it primarily as a way to measure my CO2. And basically what it's doing is your water is going to be up at a level that's kind of inside this thing, inside the drop checker. And as it's there, it's releasing CO2 out of the water and it's hitting the bromophenol blue, the solution in here, and it's going through that whole carbonic acid change, the color change, which will release the hydrogen and cause the bromophenol blue to change, right? Because that drop in pH increases the color from blue to green to yellow. What generally happens is your color will use, they talk about being at green. Don't go green. I mean, greens, they say it's 10 to 15. It's not 10 to 15. It's maybe 5 to 8 parts per million, which is very, very low for a planet tank, for a high-tech planet tank. You really want to be as close to the yellow as you can in using this type of macro way of qualitative way of measuring your CO2. You can't have too much. If it gets to that yellow point, you got to be careful. Watch your fish if you have fish in there. I have this thing where, and I get a lot of grief for this, I dial my CO2 up to the point where I know I can see the fish starting to kind of be affected a little bit, and then I dial it back down just a touch. So I know that my CO2 is super saturated in the water, but it's not enough to affect the fish. It's not the best way of doing it, but I don't always have my pH meter to check it. And for me, this will tell me, I walk by my tank, I'll look at it and realize, okay, it's a little too much, I'll dial that back just a touch. And this will give me an indication of whether I have enough CO2 in the tank. But so this is a great way, if you're running a high-tech tank or a CO2 tank, just to kind of go by and do a quick check. If the color looks like it's in blue, then you either ran out of CO2 or there's something wrong with your CO2 system. Now, there are ways to do CO2 DIY. How many of you guys have done the yeast CO2? Okay, there's a few of us. I mean, this is what I used to do way back when. Like, I would run 3 of these bottles in tandem and switch one out every week. So they go for about 2 weeks. And you can produce a good amount of CO2, but it's highly inconsistent. So you get this spike in amount of CO2 and then it kind of bleeds off. Spike and it kind of bleeds off. It's attractive short term, but it gets expensive. I mean, it does get expensive because it's kind of ridiculous how expensive sugar can be when you're trying to make this stuff all the time. Also, it stinks. I've had my wife complain about like the smell when she comes into the kitchen. I'm dumping this stuff out, and if you tip it over, it makes a god awful mess in your tank. It is horrible. It's like it takes several weeks to get that smell, the gunk out of the tank. It gets all over the tank. The old method used to be just 2 cups of sugar, baker's yeast, water, baking soda, and you could get about 1 to 2 weeks of steady CO2. I had a friend of mine in Dallas when I lived there who was a yeast biologist. She was looking at doing, she was doing her PhD in yeast genetics, primarily for a brewer, basically designing a yeast that would produce alcohol long term. So she had this thing down to an art, and she had a 180-gallon tank with about 3 of these bottles hooked up in tandem, and was growing some of the most amazing plants in a 180-gallon tank using DIY. It was impressive. I've never seen anything like it. But she uses less sugar, because as you convert the sugar to alcohol, that actually becomes toxic to your yeast. Protein, she uses a protein mix, and that's actually pretty critical. Yeast, they're functioning, living cells, and they need protein to keep producing. So she adds protein mix. Molasses has a bunch of amino acids, and then she uses baking soda to kind of get the pH. But the key was that she was using a champagne wine yeast, which is a lot more resistant to the amount of alcohol, and it actually can go. It can get started at colder temperatures. And that was one of the keys, is that when in the winter, your yeast CO2 drops, whereas the yeast wine will keep producing at a pretty good rate. And she would get 3 to 4 weeks out of each of these bottles. So it was pretty impressive. Nowadays, I would never go back to the yeast CO2. Nowadays, there is a DIY citric acid CO2 system. I had one. I was trying to find it to bring to today's meeting. It basically was this little contraption where you screw in 2 bottles, one with citric acid, one with baking soda, like saturated baking soda. You'd start a siphon, get the acid going into the baking soda to start the reaction. And so citric acid, baking soda basically creates CO2. You put equal amounts in each of the bottles, add some water, and mix it up real well. Now, nowadays, there's online, you can find these systems. Actually, I looked into this, and I'd actually probably try to use one of these and give it a shot on a low-tech tank. It's fairly safe. And I say fairly safe because some of the one that I had before didn't have a release valve. So when the pressure increased on it, and you squeeze the bottle, you can definitely tell that it was kind of ready to pop. So I'm not a big fan of those. This one actually has a release valve, a safety valve, that the pressure goes above a certain amount and you'll vent it off and release that pressure. These systems nowadays have needle valves. It has a pressure gauge. You can even have a solenoid, so you can shut off your CO2 at night. It's impressive. And this is stainless steel, so I don't worry about the bottle exploding. Something I always kind of worried about. They're not terribly expensive. And the CO2 can really work at a fairly good rate. You can get 2 weeks, maybe 3 weeks at 3 bubbles per second, which is pretty fast. It's a pretty good amount. And I know someone who's running a low-tech tank with one of these. He gets 3 months, but he's only doing maybe 1 bubble a second. So it's actually fairly efficient. Same problem though, you gotta buy the citric acid, you gotta buy the baking soda is cheap, but citric acid can get kind of expensive over the time. But you get a much longer and more steady CO2 than you would with yeast CO2 because it's not organism dependent on producing the CO2. So I think this system runs about 70, I think 60 or 70 bucks. There's a little bit more simpler designs that are cheaper, and they actually work quite well. I've seen them at, what's the place? Aquarium Adventure. I think Fluval has one that has a system kind of like this. And so I just want to show that this guy was using this system in his little small nano tank. Now, what do you guys see wrong with this picture? Well, it tanks outside and it's not attached to something. So if you knock it over, which if you have pets, it'll happen. That's how my yeast got into my tank. So you just got to be careful to make sure that it's attached. And they're all pressurized. You want to be careful about that kind of stuff. Okay, so pressurized CO2. Now we're going to get into the nitty gritty. This is higher upfront cost. However, long term, you're going to pay less because you're talking about initial cost, getting this stuff, all the materials together, and then setting up the CO2. You can get, if you're not running at a stupid high rate of CO2, I can get 3 months, sometimes almost 4 months out of a 5-pound tank on a 29 or 30 gallon tank. And that's a long time benefit. You're only refilling the tank maybe twice a year, 3 times a year, right? And each refill is maybe $20, sometimes less if you can find the right places. So you're paying a lot less long term than you would if you're running DIY, right? Size of the tank is always a factor. The bigger the tank, the more complex your CO2 system is going to have to be. And I'll kind of explain why. In smaller tanks, you can get away with smaller systems, smaller cylinders. The cost is all often quite a bit less. And this, for instance, this is the Aquatic paintball regulator. These are about 40 to 50 bucks online. Not terribly expensive. Also not the most stable CO2 regulators. I have one. I've used it, and depending on the components, sometimes you get a little bit of release of CO2 that's a little higher than you want, and so there's a little bit of a kind of a wavering. The CO2 is not always steady. It's kind of one of those things, you get what you pay for, right? So the larger tanks, though, you're going to need to have more CO2 injected into the tank, and that's going to require a larger cylinder. And a larger cylinder requires a different type of regulator. You can actually adapt paintball cylinder regulators to a regular cylinder. I don't like doing that. The amount of pressure that's in some of these regulators they're exposed to these regulators can start to wear down the parts over time. And so you got to be a little careful of that. So like anything, a 75-gallon tank, I'm going to use a standard regulator that you can get on the market. Now, one of the other things that you absolutely have to have is a check valve. And the reason for that is once your CO2 shuts off at night, you're going to get water moving backwards, back into the cylinder at night, because there's no pressure pushing it back out, right? This will keep it from doing that. That will go back into the body. The water will go back into the body of your regulator. And if you have a solenoid, which most of these little regulators have nowadays, that's going to destroy your solenoid. And you want to protect your investment, right? So you make sure that having a check valve will kind of protect your investment. It's cheap. Right? I know they run anywhere from $5 to $15, and they're readily available. If you don't have one, I just get a little air valve, check valve that you can get for dirt cheap. But just realize that those will eventually break down. The rubber in them gets kind of hard and brittle, and that water eventually they'll quit working. So I spend the extra bit on a good check valve. There's different stages. And I meant to add a slide that I totally forgot. Paintball, you got single stage and dual stage. Nowadays, you can get a dual stage regulator for basically the cost of what a single stage used to be. And the reason I would go with the dual stage is because the single stage, there's not a way to protect into the tank dump. And what this is basically there's no way for the regulator to regulate the amount of CO2 being vented out at the very end of your cylinder. When the cylinder is almost empty, it'll dump all the CO2 into your tank at one time. And that'll end up killing basically everything in your tank. I've had that happen. None of my regulators are single stage anymore. I think that one is the only one I have left, and I don't use that one. The dual stage basically has a mechanism that it prevents the second portion, or it prevents the pressure from dropping below a certain amount on the regulator itself, so that it can't open up the valves all the way. The single stage doesn't have that second mechanism, and so once that pressure drops, it basically opens up that valve completely, and the CO2 dumps all out into your tank. It's worth the money to get the dual stage. So this is, like I said, this is a paintball. Paintballs don't have that capability. When they run out, they run out. They just kind of slow bleed and they run out. One of the other things we'll talk about is cylinder to the regulator washer. This is very important for a larger cylinder, larger regulator. And like I mentioned, you get kind of what you pay for. Greenleaf aquariums, CO2 Art, UNS has some ADA, and SR Aquaristic, a company that's in our area. I use one of theirs. I have a Greenleaf aquarium cylinder regulator. I have a CO2 Art regulator. I have a UNS regulator, and then I have an ADA one that I don't ever use because it's overly priced, and it's used for smaller tanks, nano tanks, and so you have to get the disposable cylinders, which I absolutely don't want to do anymore. If you have the money, this is a paintball regulator that runs about 150 bucks. GLA sells these. They're expensive. GLA is expensive, but they make quality products. It has a solenoid. It has a very good needle valve, and it's built real solid. Let me send this around. This is one of the paintball regulators, and this I got back in 1996, 97. It's from a company called Bailin Unlimited. If you feel how heavy that thing is, it's dense, it's solid. This was before that company. They originally were the direct manufacturers of ADA's, their small cylinder, their small regulators. And I knew about them because I work in the scientific industry, and we use those in our labs. I was able to get myself one of these, and it's a solid regulator. It doesn't have a needle valve. It doesn't have a solenoid, but I could add one very easily. It's a very, very well made regulator. And a lot of them are marketed and built based on that model. Bailin it's been around for years and years, and they're basically the distributors for that particular type. But yeah, if you're going to get one, spend a little bit extra up front. Get yourself a good quality product. Now, the other thing is getting a larger regulator. Like I mentioned, I have a GLA one that's older. This is one of their first regulators, single stage, but they have dual stage regulators now that are reasonably priced. I say reasonably because it's $250 is what you're going to be spending up front for a good dual stage regulator. Nowadays, you can go up in price up to $500, $600. And the reason for that is you can add different manifolds onto it. I think their highest cost for this particular regulator has 5 manifolds. So you, in essence, you could run 5 tanks with one regulator, which is kind of nice. I have a dual manifold one that I'm running, and it makes it easier for me to add CO2 to 2 tanks that are right next to each other instead of having 2 cylinders, 2 regulators, 2 everything. This makes it easy. Now, one of the things that's really important though is the washer. And the reason for that is, I'm gonna send these guys around. Little small washers. And just kind of feel the difference between each of those. That, in a regulator, a standard regulator, that seals your regulator to your cylinder. Without it, you're gonna get leaks. The way it does is as you close it up, it pinches and kind of compresses the washer against the cylinder so that you don't get leaks in the gas. One of the great ways to check this is just take a little bit of soap water and spray it around the regulator at the entrance of, where it's connected to make sure that you're not getting bubbles being formed. If you get a bubble, that's a leak. One of the things that I've seen online, and I used one of these at one point, was the Permaseal. Not a fan of them because that rubber starts to break down, and you start ending up getting leaks. And the problem with it is that rubber can get back into your regulator once the CO2 is done dumping. So you got to be careful with that. The Permaseal starts to break down, right? So and you pay a lot. It's not terribly expensive, but why ruin your regulator? Okay. And we'll kind of get into the dispensing CO2 in a second. But avoid knockoffs, right? So this is another, CO2 Art is another one that's a fairly good price. 150 is a very good starting price for a dual stage regulator. They are a good company. I have actually at this point I have multiples of their regulators. Very good quality and well built. Inexpensive, at least in my opinion, inexpensive. You get what you pay for, right? Don't get beer regulator, the beer regulators, the CO2 beer regulators. They're not designed for very, very precise measurements of CO2. I started out with a couple of those, and some of the problems I used to have with those, you have gauges go out, your spreads would get stripped, the needle valves weren't very good at the time, so you basically get parts of the needle valves get popped off, all kinds of problems. There are knockoffs. They're like F-Zone, I know, is a company that sells a lot of the regulators. They're okay, but I've heard enough problems that occur with some of the leaks and stuff, and their solenoids are really poor quality. The person I know has had, I think, 3 different solenoids at this point replaced by the company, and he's just given up. So look for quality components for a pressurized system. Now, diffusing CO2 is the other key. Flow in the tank is critical. Without good flow, CO2 is not going to get distributed, right? The thing that we're trying to target is exposing that CO2 as long as possible in the water so that it gets absorbed and diffuses into the water. There are a couple of different ones that we can, like the in-tank diffusers are great. And I have multiple ones. CO2, the glass ones. So these are inexpensive, not terribly expensive. I mean, you can get some between $15, $20. They're made of either glass, plastic. Now, I can't tell you guys how many glass ones I've broken, like consistently all the time. I quit using glass ones because I think I have cuts on my hands and scars on my hands from when I was trying to pull the tubing off. So I've gone strictly to just the plastic ones, and the plastic ones are great. They're easy to clean, easy to maintain. You drop them into a 50-50 mix of bleach, let them sit for maybe an hour, clean them off, put them right back into the tank, and they're going to produce really super fine bubbles. Glass is pretty. I admit that. I love the look, but I can probably, in estimate, I've probably broken between 15 to 20 of the glass ones at this point. I've just given up. And I mean, that's hundreds of dollars that I've spent on those things. And I got to a point where it's not worth it. These plastic ones are all over the market. They're very expensive, different sizes. They all come in different sizes. So the larger the tank, you want a larger one, right? A small tank, drop it down to a small nano size diffuser. Easy to use. Now, where do you put these diffusers? Who can tell me where you put the diffuser? So that's actually not true. Right there. So what you want to do is you want to hit, if your flow is horizontal, hits the glass and then comes down, where you want the diffuser is at the bottom corner so that it gets pushed across the tank and has a much longer exposure in your water than if it was at the top. The problem with the one, I used to do that. I actually used to put the diffuser kind of right below the hose. Problem is because it doesn't have as much distance to go up to the top, you're losing CO2 at that point. I actually didn't know that. I was thinking, okay, the filter's going to push it down and you're going to get exposure for a longer period of time. No, actually, a lot of people have gone to the point where they're starting to put it at the bottom portion of the corner so that we get full exposure to the water. Now, there are other ways of dispensing it, right? And this is one of my favorite ways. It's called an atomizer or a nebulizer. I'll hand this around. This is an awesome way that they came up with for getting CO2 into a larger tank. Basically, it's super fine, same thing, sintered glass or sintered ceramic. You get these super, really fine bubbles that is basically pushed around in your tank, right? It produces a very fine mist, or what they sometimes call the fog, CO2 fog. And it's the thing that I've read in the past couple of years, it's in the bar report. If you go through and you look for this particular topic, this superfine mist, the superfine fog, actually will get caught up in the plants, and the plants can use it directly. That was something that was a little different. It's dependent on your nebulizer being very, very, very clean. So it has to produce really, really fine bubbles. If you start seeing larger bubbles, it's time to clean the nebulizer or the atomizer. So the way it works is it basically attaches to the output. Hang on a second. It attaches to the output, right here, output of your canister filter. So this is one that you have to have an additional equipment for. If you look at this thing as it goes around, there are two sections where the tubing attaches, and as the filter pushes the water out, it'll push the atomized CO2 out into the tank. Same thing, it's going to push it around the tank. Obviously, in this case, because it's going from the top, it's not going to have as long an exposure. But the assumption is because it's super, super fine, as it's going into the tank, it's going to be able to kind of get pushed in and used much more quickly than, say, a diffuser. So like I said, the CO2, it connects to one portion of the nebulizer or the atomizer, and your inlet goes on one section, the outlet goes on the other, and it basically gets pushed out into the tank. And what it looks like is this really, really fine mist, which is kind of cool. Some people hate it because it makes it look cloudy in the tank. So if you have a super, super clear tank and then you have this thing going around, it does look cloudy. I don't care because I know my plants love it. It's great for my plants. And I know it's working. If I don't see that mist and I start seeing bigger bubbles, then I want to do a clean of my atomizer. Yeah.
How would you go about cleaning one of the inline diffusers?
These guys. So the beauty of this one is, and not the one that I'm passing around, but this one completely comes apart. And you can actually, one of the things I do is I buy an extra ceramic disc. You can buy those on Amazon or a lot of these other places. This particular one is a Quanvee, Quanvee. It's a great nebulizer. It's the one that I use on my tank, and I just buy a couple of extras, the ceramic discs, and replace it, and take the other one and drop it into bleach, and it cleans it off really nicely. Yep.
Any issue with reactors that hold output, that the output millness for those of us who are driven crazy fiber nest?
You can. So, hang on. One of the things I did do on one of my tanks, because my wife hated the mist, I put it into a reactor. I basically used this inline atomizer, and it went into basically a empty canister filter, and it gave time for the mist to basically saturate into the water. That's the only way I know it kind of to get around it. If you have longer, obviously, if you have a longer hose and tubing, it can potentially get more saturated in the tank, but it's kind of one of those either love it or hate it kind of thing. No. Okay, reactors. This is one of the last ones that we'll talk about dispensing. You need appropriate flow. Oh, sorry. Yep.
So, when the mist is, when the outlet is at the top of the tank and the mist comes out, doesn't the CO2 dissipate up to the top and not reach the pines below?
It can. So again, it's like I mentioned, it depends on your filter outflow. If you have a strong enough flow, which you should be able to see kind of a ripple effect when the water comes out of the outflow, it'll push that water to the other side of the glass and then push it down. So if you don't have enough flow from the canister filter, what you're going to end up doing is it'll kind of float up, the flow will kind of move up and dissipate or kind of spread. You'll get some that goes into the tank, but you will get some that's going to dissipate off into the environment. So flow's critical.
You can put a little elbow, and a guy with a little elbow.
Yeah.
And it'll push the water down the river.
And the mist is not, I mean, the CO2 distribution is just as good as having the one that you put below.
It is, yeah, because you're actually getting a lot of CO2 from that. The amount of CO2 coming out of the atomizer is actually, you can dial that up and down quite dramatically. And so the amount that is coming out of your canister, the outflow, that can be adjusted. And the way that you can adjust is basically measuring your pH. So I say your pH is only going down 0.5, you can adjust adding a little bit more CO2 into it, and you'll see more of the mist, but at the same time, you're going to really saturate the amount of CO2 that's coming in. Some of it, like I said, is going to get dissipated. There are other ways that I know others have used output tubes that go down to toward the bottom of the tank, and it comes out instead of the output being up here, they have the output kind of midway down. I'm not a big fan of that. Part of it is because there's CO2, oxygen there's a gas exchange that is really important for the health of your tank. One of the things that people don't realize is that you have to have oxygen in the tank as well, because there is a certain, when the tank shuts down in the evening, the plants are going through respiration, right? And so they're producing CO2 at that point. If you don't have good oxygen exchange, the plants are not going to be able to respire, and they're not growing basically at that point. So you want both aspects. It's not just, it's also important for the health of your fish. Saturating your CO2 in your tank it's important for the plants, but saturating too much is also going to be, it's going to have a negative impact on the livestock in the tank. And then also with the photosynthesis and the different cycles that you have when it switches day and night, that's going to be important to have enough O2 saturation. And you want that exchange to be very good. And one of the things that they talk about is as CO2 saturation increases, you want that exchange to be going off. You want the CO2 to be coming off once that tank is saturated. You don't want it to be continually absorbing that CO2. because obviously it becomes a danger at that point. Okay. With the reactors, like I mentioned, with everything, you need good flow. They want to increase the amount of time that the CO2 is exposed in the reactor so that it absorbs into the water. So the longer the contact, the better for CO2 absorption. Now, there's a point here that, and this is something I made a mistake. With CO2 in a reactor, your reactor has to be long enough for the water to completely absorb that CO2. If it's too short, you're going to get some absorption, but a lot of the CO2 gets pushed right back out, right? And you end up having a very inefficient reactor. I know that like for some people with like a 125 gallon tank, they have I think up to like a 3.5, almost 4 foot reactor. So they know that that CO2 is getting absorbed into the water. Anything shorter than that, and then they start seeing issues. They are looking for something that's going to be 100% dissolved in the water before it goes into the tank. So you shouldn't see CO2 coming out of your output pipe. You shouldn't see any kind of bubbles or anything that are being burped into your tank. And the way they set it up is basically, this is an external reactor. It's not inline or anything. Well, it is kind of inline. You're basically injecting CO2 into the tank, and as the filter pushes water out. Yeah, as the filter pushes water out, the CO2 gets pushed down and then back up into the tube, and then it goes into the tank. So you don't want to put the CO2 at the bottom. You want it at the top where it's getting pushed throughout the entire reactor and being absorbed as it goes back into the tank. Obviously, these are some that you need to kind of potentially keep upright. The reactors, and that's one of the caveats, is that if it's on its side, there's a path for the water or for the CO2 to go out of the reactor. You want the CO2 having the longest amount of exposure and resistance in the reactor itself. There's different types of reactors. The two different types that I've used are the Sturgis reactor. These are kind of it's just a water softener, a water filtration unit. You got you pipes that connect in the input and output of the output filter. You create a way for the CO2 to go in, and it basically mixes the CO2 as it goes in. The problem what I've heard with this is that you get a lot of air trapped in the top of the reactor. You got to burp it. And I think there's a button over here that you can set up so that you can burp that CO2 out. They're bulky, and so if you don't have a lot of space under your stand, it takes up a lot of room, and it can be kind of difficult to maneuver around. There's also a Rex Grig reactor, same kind of concept, except with this one, the CO2 is pushed. You get the output that comes out of here, and the CO2 is basically mixed as it comes mixed inside this tube as it goes back out. This is a one that you need a long enough reactor. If you have a larger the tank, you're going to need to mix it longer. The short ones tend to be, the CO2 gets pushed right back out of the reactor. Now, I've seen this one. This one is a GLA, and I've seen other designs of it. This one I've seen talked about online quite a bit. It is basically another CO2 reactor, very, very similar in some ways to a Sturgis reactor, just a lot prettier. So, and it's a little bit easier to work with. You connect the CO2 here, input, output, same kind of thing. And I think there are different types of media that you can add to it to help the CO2 be exposed to the water longer term. If I remember correctly, this runs about 120, 130 bucks. Yes, pretty but expensive. So depending on what you're doing, and if like I know people who have their cabinets completely exposed, and if people want to see their filters and their reactors and everything. If you want something that looks pretty, this would work.
I've seen some pictures that put cable in medium.
I'm sorry?
I've see some pictures of what's in media.
Yeah, yeah, yep. Yeah, I think this is some of the concept is based on like CO2 reactors for salt water, kind of the same concept. Whew. Okay, so yeah, it's a little bit more expensive than I thought. There are knockoffs online. I think those run about 70 or 80. No. And I think I found them as low as 50 on Alibaba. So caveat there, just keep that in mind.
Might see that at the holiday party.
Okay, so in summary, CO2, it is a macronutrient. We do need it for our plant growth and absolutely critical aside from your NPK. Ideally, what you're trying to target is 30 to 40 for a very high-tech tank, right? Something where your CO2 saturated, your plant growth is pushed to the maximum. And that's usually equates to about a 1 degree drop. Not all of us want to run it at like what I would consider like a Ferrari speed planted tank. So I tend to dial it down. I like moderate growth. I don't like having to prune my plants weekly. And so I target between 25 to 30, and only on certain occasions do I push it above if I have certain plants that I really want to get going. Flow time in contact is critical, right? So that's key. Longer the CO2 is exposed to water, the better it's going to dissolve, the more exposure it's going to have. And in some cases, if you have the super microfine bubbles, if you can get that into the tank with the atomizer, your plants can actually take advantage of that. So there's an advantage to having the atomizers. There's a lot of DIY methods. I've kind of talked about it. I might use the citric acid stuff, but I think my days of yeast and stuff like that are long, long gone. Just better stability and lower long-term costs. But maintaining the CO2 is absolutely key for your planted tank. In addition to your nutrients, that's the one nutrient that you absolutely have to have. And it's going to equate to better growth. And also the big one is prevention of algae. And that's what we all try to target is algae's in the tank. But if we can keep the CO2 levels up enough so that the nutrients are taken advantage of by the plants, the algae is not going to be able to utilize that stuff. So, any questions? Yep.
Of the three methods you talked about, which is your favorite?
So my favorite is the atomizer. I've kind of gone away from reactors. For me, they're bulky. They take up space. They have to be cleaned, and that's the other thing. If you're using a reactor and it starts getting gross on the inside, the amount of CO2 that's being dissolved decreases. So you gotta keep that in mind. With atomizer, I don't, when I'm doing a water change, I can, do the shut off valve, pull the pipes, bring it to the sink, clean it off real quick and put it right back on. I don't have to take apart all my filters and everything to get that going. It's super, super easy. And they're cheap. As we just saw, $150 for a reactor is ridiculous. Yep.
A couple comments from my experiences here. I started with the inline atomizer. They worked great. I wasn't a fan of this fine bubble mist. My water was crystal clear, and then I had that, and it seemed kind of counterproductive to me. And so it bothered me for a while. They work great. They're good. I wouldn't have any problem using them except for that, so they kind of stop. And I also kind of like the idea of like being as efficient with CO2 as possible. So I switched to reactors. I have 2 reactors. They're great. There's pros and cons to all these ones. The one thing with the reactor is, if you walk by your tank, you have no idea the CO2 is on at all.
Yep.
You don't know what level it's at. You can't like walk by and look at it.
No.
The water is crystal clear. There's nothing, no bubbles, nothing. So that could be a little, if you don't have your bubble counter filled, which I usually never did, it's like your solenoid's on, and then you're like, yeah, I think the CO2's on, but you don't know. So just keep that in mind too. The other thing too about cylinders, because everyone always has to decide like what size cylinder. 5-pounders are fine. I have 10-pounders. the bigger the cylinder, it's actually cheaper for the CO2. They don't charge you by the pound. There's like a fill-up fee, and then there's like by the pound. So the bigger your cylinder is, the cheaper your CO2 is. But 20-pound cylinders get a little heavy. It's not just 20 pounds of CO2, it's also the cylinder's pretty heavy. So if it's a little too heavy for you, don't do that. It's also kind of tall. Some people have a problem where if they put the regular on top of this 20-pound cylinder, they cannot fit it under the stand. It's like 1 or 2 inches too big. There's some workarounds, but keep that in mind. I would only get a 20-pound cylinder if you're okay with like the weight and you're willing to possibly have to put it next to the aquarium. If that doesn't sound appealing to you, don't do a 20-pounder, do a 10-pounder. But just keep in mind, like, I personally, I'm not a fan of like 5 pounders. I'd rather just only get 10 pounders. But that's because it's just so much cheaper in the long run.
I can tell you, if you're a woman, you cannot get a full 20-pound cylinder in your truck. You can get it in the back seat of your car. I actually went to the store and got a full 20, and I told the guy, I want to see if I can get it in my car. I could not get it in my truck.
They're heavy. Yeah, they're very, very heavy.
We live in the back seat, but it's like, no, it's not meant for me.
Yep.
Oh, it is.
It's still really heavy. Scott?
One other thing I learned is I spent a lot of money on aluminum cylinders. They're beautiful. The only thing though is there's some places that don't fill up CO2. They only do the swap. Okay, so then you're not going to want to give them your $150 or $200, whatever they cost nowadays, aluminum cylinder and get back some beat up piece of steel. They're not going to want to do it. So that's going to limit where you can fill up, which may be a problem, maybe not, depending on where you live. The other thing too is, which I didn't realize, you have to do the what they call
hydro test.
You have to do a hydro test.
Yep.
Which is there's like $30, $40 something. They take your cylinder. What is it, like every 4 years?
It's about every 4 or 5 years.
So so that adds up. Plus they're gonna take your cylinder. You don't have a second cylinder, now you have no CO2.
Yep.
So honestly, if I was to do this all over again, I'd probably just do the swapping. You're gonna have an ugly, beat up old cylinder all the time, but you don't have to worry about, that type of thing ever. I know someone who goes and buys used cylinders that are out of date. They just go to the first day, swap it out, and they give them one in date. They never pay for the hydro test. So it's another way to kind of save some money and not have to worry about it. Do I love my aluminum cylinders though? Yeah, they're great. They look fantastic. But if I was to do this all over again,
Yeah, I mean, I've talked to people in the past when I encourage them, if you don't want to buy a aluminum cylinder and then try to find a place that'll fill it for you, go on Marketplace, Facebook Marketplace, get a used, just a standard 5-pound cylinder and bring it to a place that swaps out. Don't go to some place like Airgas or a specialty gas place. They're ridiculously expensive. Go to a welding shop or someplace that does that. Fire extinguisher place. You can get them for half the cost.
Some of the hydroponic stores.
Yep.
I was at one out in Elgin, St. Charles area the other day, and the prices were very good.
Yep.
Where was it? Yeah. I can look it up for you. There's a hydroponic store in St. Charles, Elgin area. So check the hydroponic stores too, because the hydroponics people use CO2 as well.
Yeah, that's where I bring mine, is to a place in Gurnee. Yeah, I like the place in Gurnee because they refill it. They also don't look at the hydro test, which is bad. I mean, I should retest it. I should test mine, but I have enough cylinders that it would cost me an arm and a leg to do them all at one time. Yep.
So if you go to like a welding company or whatever, is there like a quality of CO2 gas that you're supposed to purchase?
CO2 is pretty much CO2. Yeah, there's really not big difference. I'm sorry? There's really not. It's just CO2. Yeah. That's not the case. Yeah, it's CO2. I mean, CO2 is basically, your dry ice is CO2. That's how they make the CO2. And it's liquid, and then it converts into gas. Sublimation. It's called sublimation, right? So the liquid CO2 in your tank produces a gas. Liquid CO2, that going into your tank, it's not gonna matter what's in it. Yep. Yep.
My experience has been they don't care if you bring in another one, they can walk out with a little bit more.
Yeah.
So find a place that doesn't fit on site.
Yep. No.
You have steel cylinders with a star on them. Those are have to be tight to touch the only one for the tender.
Yeah.
Might be a silly question, but you said that you turn on your CO2 an hour or so before your lights come on.
Yep.
So does that mean CO2 needs to be manually turned on a daily basis?
No. So one of the things that let me send this around. Okay. Let me my regulator over here. There is a little contraption right here. This that's hooked up to a outlet, a plug. This is a solenoid. It basically shuts off or turns on the flow of your CO2. So at night, like it'd be right, I think I shut it off about 30 minutes before the lights go off. And the reason I do this, I don't want to have the CO2 up too high, to the point where the plants are also going to be respiring and producing CO2. It's dangerous with the fish. So I shut that off about a half hour before. And then in the morning, about an hour before, this solenoid will flip it open, and so the CO2 starts going. It's basically a mechanism to turn on and off, and it's on a timer. I use a timer on it, and it's peace of mind. You don't have to go there and flip it on, flip it on. I used to do that actually, because before the timers don't always work great. So I would get up in the morning before I get my coffee, flip it on. It's awesome. Yeah, it changed everything. Smart plugs are amazing. So yeah, yep.
Now, I was talking around for regulators, and someone mentioned about that the German-made ones are better than the ones
so you got to be careful with that. Like some of the German-made ones, the fittings are different. And so there is Tunes is a very old company that's been around for years and years. They make really good quality regulators. Problem is the fittings are different, so they won't fit on our standard CO2 cylinders. And the cylinders are all the same. For the US made cylinders, they're CGA 320, I think that's what it is, 320, which means all the regulators that are made in the US or that have that 320 fitting will fit on this cylinder. The German ones are different. They won't fit on this cylinder. And to find the part that goes into the regulator that also fits this is an absolute nightmare. I had one of those because I thought, oh, I'm going to buy a German one. And yeah, I spent a good 6 months finding the right part. And even then, it didn't fit just right.
You can get them on Amazon, you can go to the international and go German or EU.
Yeah.
And then there's a lot of, let's just say, offshore now coming are bad.
Yeah, they don't fit they don't fit perfectly. I mean, this was 20 years ago, and I bought it at an AGA convention. I thought, oh, I got it cheap, and like I'm gonna get a nice cheap regulator. Yeah, but they really have. The regulators now they're inexpensive, relatively inexpensive, and they're really nice. They're well made. They're solid stainless steel, and they work really well.
Back in the day,
Oh, that one. So that's a paintball one. It only tells you what's in this, what the pressure is inside your tank, inside the cylinder. And so I'm going to show you guys how to put these things together. I think the fear is that a lot of people are afraid of regulators and putting them together and getting them started. Super easy to do. Yeah, the cylinder's scary. It can be. If you're not familiar with it, it can be. There's a little bit of a factor of you trying to get used to having something turn on real quick and might burst open. Yep.
I have a question about exactly. Any safety considerations about having a CO cylinder inside the home?
Yeah, keep it upright. Keep it strapped against something. That's absolutely critical because if it drops down, the CO2 is liquid, right? If it drops down, it's going to flow out into your regulator, and when it hits that regulator and it hits exposure air or something, it expands real quickly. And so you can have an explosive fact is something that might create a kind of I wouldn't say explosion, but you could have some of that a pretty big bang based on the pressure. So just make sure that I strap mine to my cylinders just for safety.
What some home world has, a lot of people do is either get 5-gallon, 10-gallon bucket, put it down
Mhm.
with gravel or leca or even bags of sand around it.
Yep.
That way you
Yep.
That's guaranteed.
Aaron?
The paintball CO2, that's a single stage, right?
Yes. Yep.
So you do run the risk of.
Yep. I mean, so one of the things I do each week when I do maintenance is I'll go and check my regulators. I just look at the gauge, right? I mean, when we get this thing going, when I get this stuff up, what you're going to notice the first gauge measures the pressure of your CO2. Like it should be anywhere from 500 to 800, depending on the temperature of your CO2. Colder the CO2, the lower the pressure. As this warms up to a temp, the pressure on that first gauge is going to get closer and closer to 800. Now, if that pressure starts dropping, that means the CO2 in here is run out, and that it's basically all gaseous pressure at that point, right? There's no more liquid pressure kind of expanding out to fill the rest of the cylinder. So I just keep an eye on that, and as that starts to drop, I realize that okay, that at a certain point I'm going to have to flip that CO2 cylinder out for a fresh one. And it's like I said, you're doing water changes once a week. It should be pretty regular. It's just something a quick check and you're good to go.
One quick thing, like today was like when it's colder, either in your trunk or when you go fill it up, they hand it back to you. It's very cold.
Mhm.
I don't know if anybody realizes that. It's very, very cold. So I've been in home, even in the summer, it's still kind of cold. So a little bit. So keep that in mind. The working pressure, which is the one they call it. So
The working pressure, yeah.
that will change a little bit.
Yep.
So you look down the side. It's not just because it's cold outside, but they filled it up. It just filled up.
Yeah. Yeah, and they fill these based on weight, right? So I know that my hydroponic tends to go a little bit over because like I'm giving you a little bit more, but I'm like, it's not necessarily a good thing because if it's over pressurized, when you first turn that on, it's gonna that amount of CO2 that's in it is just gonna pop, and you'll see that gauge shoot pretty hard.
Just a note, a lot of these hydroponic stores aren't doing so well now that you can buy your stuff in the store.
Mhm.
So a lot of them have very reduced stocks in the cost. A lot of their business.
Now the one that I go to is hydroponic. It's Home Grow, I think in Gurnee. They are specializing in cannabis, so they're doing extremely well. Extremely well. Like, I'm sorry. Was it really? Wow, that's terrible. So I'm going to go ahead and show you guys how to set up. Okay. So, sorry. Okay.
So you're saying once it reaches 500, the needle that
Mhm.
you shouldn't go below that, or you can?
Well, I watch it. Right. I mean, if you have a good dual stage regulator, you can basically bleed that down to the very end.
Okay.
I don't try to do that. It just there's not as likely a possibility in the tank dump, but if you get really delicate fish, why take a chance? I mean, it's really at that point, there's no more CO2 in the tank, in the cylinder, right? It's all gas at that point. You got to remember CO2 in those cylinders, it's liquid. It's not gaseous. That's when it sublimates, which is conversion of liquid to gas. That gas is basically being, as it's being pushed out, that gas or the liquid keeps producing gaseous CO2. If you're getting to the point where that pressure is dropping, that means nothing else is replacing that, and your cylinder is empty.
So you shouldn't go below.
I don't usually. I mean,
because it's not producing CO2 or just.
It's not producing anymore. That's whatever's in there is in that cylinder is what is giving that pressure, right? And so that it has CO2 in it, but it's not producing any more from the liquid. There's no more liquid in it to replace what's in there.
So you should.
I usually replace it at that point.
The worst part is running out of gas and you don't know when it's going to.
Yep. Yeah.
It could be next day, it could be next week.
Yep.
You want to take a chance? You know? Just swap it out.
Yeah.
Swap the cylinder. Okay, so the check valve.
Mm-hmm.
How do you know when that gets bad? Is there a way to?
Oh, you'll be able to tell. The water just goes right through it. Should the check valve, if it's a good quality check valve, will stop the water. It won't go beyond that check valve. Mm-hmm. If the check valve is damaged or is no longer functioning, that water will go right through it.
Any advantage to putting an air loop on your CO2 line? You know, we do it with air hoses so that it doesn't. I mean, there's pros and cons.
Well, not really, because what you're doing is you're still getting back pressure from the water itself, and so it doesn't really help a lot. I've seen it just push all the way through.
Because I've had some for 3-4 years.
I replace mine every 6 months.
Really?
Yep. I mean, here's the thing. I've paid a lot of money for these regulators, right? It's peace of mind. I wouldn't say every 6 months, every year. I replace them every year. Like at Christmas, I give myself a Christmas present. I buy a bunch of check valves.
Even the really nice ones?
Yeah. Even the nice ones will go bad eventually. I mean, it's just something to keep in mind. They all have a lifetime. There's a rubber in them that goes back and forth to keep the pressure. Like I had mentioned before, with the regular regulators, you have that the ring that presses up against your cylinder and keeps it from leaking. With the paintball ones, you don't have that capability. So I always use a little bit of plumber's tape. Don't need a lot, and this one's really big. Go the direction that you're going to be screwing in your regulator. Okay? If you go the opposite direction, when you screw in the regulator, it's going to strip the tape, and it's going to go into your regulator. Ask me how I know.
Well, you're our president.
I have made so many mistakes in my years running Planet tanks. I have probably wasted thousands of dollars. Okay, so go the direction that you're going for the tape. And you'll get to a point where it catches. Come on. I think that may be too much. There we go. All right, there we go. There, you just heard a pop, and that seals it up. So, like I said, this one, you do have to have plumber's tape to get this to work. Right now, this is sitting at about, what was it say about, well, it's supposed to be 800, but it's higher than that. So that's the first gauge is going to be how much CO2, what the pressure your cylinder is. Second one is what you're going to be doing to dial in the amount of CO2 that you want. And then there's the beauty of the Aquatic, you can kind of adjust that. And then you have the needle valve on the top to give you a really fine amount of CO2. And so I'll send this around so you guys can kind of see how that works. Okay. Now, this one's even easier, except you need a wrench.
Just a real quick question, how often would you recommend replacing the CO2 line?
You'll know. It gets really tough and brittle. It gets really hard to kind of manipulate. I tend to change it out when it starts changing. It starts discoloring. You get a little discoloration. That usually only takes about maybe. Yeah.
Because you
Yeah.
can't get it off.
Yeah. All right. So cylinder. This is my emergency cylinder. I have, I think at this point, 6 cylinders at home.
Is it out of date?
Oh yeah. This one's really out of date, like way out of date. Yeah, they do. Mine does. Yeah. This is a little 2.5. This is my emergency one. If I run out of CO2 and none of my cylinders are filled, I always have this as my backup.
How long does that one last?
In a 58 gallon, it'll last me a month, maybe at most. So I don't try to use this in the tank itself. I basically hook it up to let it start going, and then I go and bring my other cylinders to fill up. And for my 58, I run a 10-pound, and for my other tanks, I run 5-pound cylinders. It's just an easy way for me to have something on hand. They're easy to pick up and move around the house and stuff. Okay, so with the regulator, when you're attaching to the cylinder, you have your little O-ring or the thing. I drop it in and push to the back, to the bottom, right? Because normally this sits back right here. You push it to the front. You take that and you just kind of shove it toward the back, right? And at that point, you just start screwing it on. You're going to get a point where it kind of stops. Okay. And what I will do at this point is get the wrench ready first. When you're screwing it in, as you screw it in, this whole face is going to want to turn, right? And so I tend to hold it upright, kind of almost horizontal to the ground. Screw it in. Tighten it up. Don't need to do it too much. That's it. And you're done. And at this point, I lost that part here. Just kind of turn it on. That's it. So this is already, if you look at this, it's already up at 800. This is exactly where you want this cylinder to be. You can adjust this, the pressure. This is, what is it about? About 25. With some of the diffusers, you're going to need to be up towards 30, 35 for the atomizers to get the good CO2 into the tank. With these guys, with the little diffusers, you can get 10 PSIs and you're going to get a ton of CO2. So it just depends on what kind of diffuser you're using in the tank. Adjusting this right here is a little counterintuitive. If you screw it in right, like righty-tighty, that actually increases the amount of CO2. Going left or the opposite way, it reduces the amount of CO2. So just keep that in mind. If you're trying to drop the CO2, you really have to kind of go backwards instead of going forward. Needle valve, it's a European thing. It's a European thing. So this one, unfortunately, I think this thing is broken, so I didn't see that. But then normally this would have a bubble counter on it, and then the tubing would go over here, and I could adjust the gas coming out based on what I have the needle valve here. Yeah, I can hear it. So I'm letting CO2 out. You should be able to hear it a little bit. I can't over this, but yeah. So with this one, you just same thing, going in on this one, the needle valve, righty closes, lefty opens. So just kind of counterintuitive to the other valve. Okay, that's it. Really, really easy. The scariest part is just when you first turn on the CO2, and when you do it enough, it becomes second nature. Any questions? Okay. All righty. Thank you. Okay. Scott, you want to do the?
All right, we're gonna do our raffle. Beth has the tickets. Put up your hand if you do not have a ticket.
Whoa!
Okay, so if you haven't been to one of our meetings, here's how the raffles work. Most of the